There was a clock in the parlour of Hollow Birch Cottage that had not moved in 30 years, and on the morning they found Eleanor Peel, it was ticking again. Miss Marple noticed the clock before she noticed the body. That, she would later reflect, was rather the point. Welcome to Cosy Pages, where every quiet night holds a story, and every page carries a gentle mystery. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the story unfold. Chapter 1. The Clock That Should Not Tick. The village of Ashenford woke, as it always did, to the sound of the dairy cart rattling along Coppice Lane at 6:30 in the morning. The wheels needed oiling. They had needed oiling since the previous April, and the noise of them against the old cobblestones was not so much a nuisance as it was a kind of comfort, a signal that the world had turned again in the night, as expected, and that the milk would arrive, and that the bread in Bateman's bakery would smell of yeast and warmth by 7, and that Ashenford would proceed in its usual unhurried fashion. Miss Jane Marple was already at her sitting-room window when the cart passed. She was not an early riser by temperament. She was in fact a great believer in the importance of a proper rest, but she had spent some portion of the night in the light, uncomfortable doze of a person whose mind refuses to altogether let go of the day. The garden had troubled her. The late frosts had been unkind to her delphiniums, and she had lain awake composing a mental note to herself about mulching that somehow became a second mental note about the curious behaviour of young George Peel, and that second note had proved altogether more persistent than the first. She was staying with her niece's acquaintance, Mrs. Dorothea Croft, in the upper village, a red brick house of no particular distinction, with a fine view of the church tower and a walled garden that Mrs. Croft tended, with the competitive devotion of a woman who knew her neighbours were watching. It was only a fortnight's visit. A rest, her doctor had called it. Miss Marple had not argued, though she privately suspected that a fortnight in Ashenford would be rather more stimulating than her doctor imagined. Ashenford was not a remarkable village to look at. It had one church, one public house, one post office, and the usual assortment of people who had lived there all their lives, arranged next to a smaller assortment of people who had arrived within the last decade, and were still, by local reckoning, newcomers. The High Street ran uphill in a gentle curve past a row of stone-fronted shops, and at the top of the hill, just where the lane turned sharp left towards the church, stood Hollow Birch Cottage, which had belonged to the Peel family for longer than anyone could exactly remember. Eleanor Peel was 73 and had lived at Hollow Birch Cottage alone since the death of her husband Edmund 12 years ago. Her son George lived in the village too, 3 streets away, with his wife Celia and their 2 children. Her daughter-in-law visited on Tuesdays. Eleanor's sister, a considerably more sociable woman named Vera Lancing, came and went from London with an energy that seemed to unsettle the village in small but persistent ways. Miss Marple had met Eleanor Peel at a Wednesday afternoon gathering at the church hall, one of those modest events arranged around tea and a speaker on a topic of mild general interest. Eleanor had spoken little but listened carefully, and Miss Marple had formed the impression of a woman who was very used to keeping her thoughts to herself. Not unhappy, not secretive, exactly, but practised at the particular discipline of not saying everything she knew. It was Mrs. Croft who telephoned at 8 o'clock that morning, though she was standing not 20 feet away in the kitchen, because she had the sort of habit of using the telephone even when it was not strictly necessary. "They've found Eleanor Peel," Mrs. Croft said, "sitting in her parlour. The home help came in this morning and couldn't wake her." Miss Marple set down her toast. "Is she dead?" "Quite dead, I'm afraid. Dr. Rennie's been called. George Peel is over there now. They're saying it was her heart." Miss Marple considered this. "Yes," she said. "I expect they are." She finished her toast, put on her good wool cardigan, collected her bag, and walked up the hill to Hollow Birch Cottage. The front door was standing open when she arrived, which was not the sort of thing that happened in Ashenford without reason. A uniformed constable stood just inside the gate with the expression of a man who had arrived expecting something manageable, and was not entirely certain he had found it. Miss Marple gave him a pleasant, absent-minded smile, the sort of smile that suggested she was simply an elderly lady who had wandered slightly off course, and he stood aside. The hallway smelled of old lavender and cold hearth and something else, faint but specific, that Miss Marple identified and did not mention. The parlour was at the end of the hall. Eleanor Peel was in her armchair by the fireplace, dressed in her day clothes, her hands resting in her lap in a posture that was almost composed. Almost. The small displacement of her left hand, turned slightly palm up, as if she had tried to catch something, told a different story to anyone willing to look. On the mantelpiece, between a china spaniel and a small framed photograph of Edmund Peel on their wedding day, stood a clock. A French carriage clock, gilt-cased, with a white enamel face. It was ticking. Miss Marple stood very still in the doorway and looked at the clock for a long time. Then she looked at Eleanor Peel. Then she looked at the clock again. The doctor and the constable were busy with their notes. George Peel sat in the kitchen with his head in his hands. No one was looking at the clock. Miss Marple thought, that clock has not worked in 30 years. She knew this because Eleanor had told her so herself at the Wednesday tea, with the particular fondness of someone describing an old imperfection they have come to love. Edmund stopped it when the spring broke, she had said. I never had it mended. It felt like part of the house. The clock was ticking, quietly, steadily, as if it had never stopped at all. Chapter 2. What the Home Help Knew. The Home Help's name was Patricia Stubbs, though everyone in the village called her Pat, and she arrived at Hollow Birch Cottage on Monday, Wednesday and Friday mornings at 8:30 to carry out the sort of domestic assistance that Eleanor Peel had. For some years accepted with a mixture of genuine gratitude and very quiet dignity. Pat was not, by any standard measure, a gossip. She was, however, a woman who had spent 20 years moving in and out of other people's houses, and she had developed the particular kind of observational acuity that comes from learning to see without appearing to look. She knew which families kept secrets, which kitchens told lies about the dinners that came out of them, and which people set their faces into careful shapes whenever she walked in. She was not a gossip, but she noticed things. Miss Marple found her in the kitchen with a cup of very strong tea and the expression of someone who has recently experienced a shock and is managing it by holding something warm in both hands. The constable had taken her statement, a brief factual account of arriving, knocking, using her key, finding the room, and telephoning, and was now occupied elsewhere. The kitchen was temporarily, peacefully quiet. "May I sit down?" Miss Marple asked. Pat looked up. She recognised Miss Marple from the church hall teas. "Of course. Shall I pour you one?" "That would be very kind." The tea was indeed very strong enough to have its own opinions, but Miss Marple drank it without comment and settled herself into the chair opposite. "It must have been quite dreadful," Miss Marple said, "finding her." It was. Pat wrapped her hands more firmly around her own mug. She looked peaceful, I thought, but she was cold, very cold. So she'd been there a while. The doctor thinks she passed in the night? That's what they're saying. Pat hesitated. Then, but she was dressed. She had her day blouse on, her good one, with the collar. She didn't, wear that to bed. Miss Marple looked at her teacup. No, I shouldn't think she would. So either she hadn't gone to bed yet, or she'd got up and dressed. But if she'd got up and dressed, why was she sitting in the armchair and not making breakfast? She was regular as anything. 8:30, she'd have her porridge. 9:15, she'd start her morning. Did anyone know her plans for yesterday evening? George was over in the afternoon, and her sister Vera was there in the evening. I saw Vera's car when I passed at about 7. The red one. You can't miss it. Miss Marple absorbed this. Did Mrs. Peel seem herself when you last saw her? On Friday morning? Pat considered carefully. She was quiet. More than usual. She had a letter on the table. She'd been reading it when I came in, and she put it away straight off. Didn't say anything about it. But she was quieter than usual after that. Distracted-like. Usually she'd chat while I was doing the floors. Friday she just sat with her hands in her lap and looked out the window. Do you know if she still had the letter? I didn't see it after that day, though that doesn't mean much. She might have put it somewhere safe, or posted something in reply, or thrown it away. Miss Marple set down her teacup. The clock in the parlour, she said. The carriage clock on the mantelpiece. Had you ever seen it working before? Pat looked at her with a sudden, alert attention that suggested the question had landed in exactly the right place. Never, she said, not in all the years I've been coming. I always thought it was broken. She used to polish it every fortnight, but it never ran. Why? It was ticking this morning, Miss Marple said. Pat put down her own cup. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment, just the sound of the refrigerator humming and a wood pigeon somewhere outside cooing its warm, repetitive thought into the morning air. Well, Pat said at last. That's a strange thing. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. It is rather. She stood up and thanked Pat for the tea, and made her way into the hall. Through the parlour doorway she could see the doctor still at work, his back to her. The clock was still ticking. She could hear it from 6 feet away, a small, meticulous sound, like someone counting. In 30 years that clock had never ticked. Eleanor herself had said so, with the warmth of a woman describing an old companion. It had been stopped on purpose. Left stopped on purpose. Edmund had stopped it, and Eleanor had honoured that pause. Someone had wound that clock. Someone had set it going again. And Miss Marple could not yet say whether that person had done so before Eleanor Peel died, or after, but she suspected, with the quiet, particular certainty that had served her well for many decades, that the answer mattered rather a great deal. She stepped outside into the cool morning and stood for a moment in the garden. The birches that gave the cottage its name were still winter bare, their white trunks cool and still in the grey April light. A robin sat on the gatepost and regarded her without alarm. Somewhere down the hill, the bell at St. Cuthbert's struck 9. Miss Marple counted the strokes. Then she turned and looked back at the cottage window, through which the silhouette of the carriage clock was just barely visible on the mantelpiece, and she thought, the hour that disappeared is in that clock somewhere. We simply have to know where to look, and in the village of Ashenford, which was old enough to understand the keeping of time, the morning continued in its unhurried way, the dairy cart long gone, the baker's cooling, the post office opening, and the small gilt clock on the mantelpiece of Hollow Birch Cottage ticking steadily into. The still air of a room that was waiting, in the patient way of rooms that have been waiting for a very long time, for someone to listen carefully to what it was saying. Chapter 3. George Peel's Grief. George Peel was 47, and he wore his middle age the way some men wear a coat that fitted them in a different decade. Not uncomfortably, exactly, but with an awareness of it. He had his mother's colouring, dark-eyed and pale-complexioned, but not her stillness. Where Eleanor had been composed to the point of seeming hewn from something durable, George moved through rooms as if each one presented a mild logistical problem he was still in the process of solving. Miss Marple found him in the garden at 10:30, standing near the old apple tree at the far end and looking at nothing in particular. He had been inside for some time, speaking to the constable and then to Dr. Rennie, and the fresh air appeared to be serving as a kind of pressure valve. "Mr. Peel," Miss Marple said, "I am so sorry." He turned. He had been crying, not recently, but earlier, and the evidence of it remained in the particular redness around his eyes that people carry after grief has temporarily passed through them. "Miss Marple," he said, "you were at the church hall last week. Mother mentioned you. She was kind to speak to me. She liked you." He looked back at the apple tree. "She was a good judge. Better than me." A pause. "I should be doing things. There will be arrangements." Celia said she'd come over, help sort the house. I just needed a moment. "Of course. Take whatever time you need." Miss Marple moved to stand beside him, The garden was modest but well kept. Tidy beds of early spring bulbs, a herb border running along the south-facing wall, and a vegetable patch to the left of the apple tree that had already been turned in preparation for planting. Eleanor had been planning ahead. That small fact settled something uncomfortable in Miss Marple's chest. "When did you last see her?" Miss Marple asked. Her voice was gentle, conversational, the question of a sympathetic elderly visitor, not a woman with a purpose. "Yesterday afternoon. About 3. I came over for tea. We had tea every Sunday. Regular as anything." He rubbed the back of his neck. "She seemed fine, a little quiet perhaps, but she often was on Sundays. I think Sundays made her think of father." "Your aunt was there in the evening?" George's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, just a small tightening around the jaw. "Vera came over at about 6. They'd had some arrangement. I didn't know about it until Vera telephoned me this morning to say she'd arrived and found Mother. Well, found her." Miss Marple turned this over quietly. "Vera found her? Not Miss Stubbs?" "Vera telephoned Pat. And Pat came and telephoned the police and the doctor. Vera was not in a state to manage the calls, apparently." His tone was not unkind, but it was precise. The precision of a man who has spent some years managing his feelings about a particular person. "I see. And you were at home from what time yesterday evening?" "From about 4. We had supper at 6. Celia and the children were in all evening. I went to bed at 10. Normal Sunday." He looked at her with a directness that suggested he had noticed the shape of her questions without yet deciding what to do with that noticing. "You don't think it was her heart?" Miss Marple met his look. "I don't know what it was," she said honestly. "Dr. Rennie is experienced and careful. If he says it was her heart, I'm sure he has reasons. I am merely curious about 1 or 2 things." "The clock," George said. Miss Marple was still for a moment. "You noticed. I noticed it the moment I walked in this morning. It was ticking. Mother used to say father stopped it when the spring broke. 1994, I think, just after they'd come back from somewhere. And she never had it mended. Said she liked it stopped. It was his clock, really. He'd inherited it from his own father." George's voice was careful, the way voices get when they are moving around something painful in the dark. "I don't know who wound it. I certainly didn't. And I can't imagine Mother doing it herself. Could the spring have simply repaired itself?" Even as she said it, Miss Marple knew the answer. George gave a short, humourless sound that was not quite a laugh. "French carriage clocks don't repair themselves. You'd need a clockmaker. Or at the very least someone who knew what they were doing." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I thought as much." A magpie landed on the fence at the end of the garden, regarded them both with its bright, rude intelligence, and then departed. George watched it go. "She had a letter," he said quietly. "On Friday, Pat mentioned it to me when I came in this morning. Said Mother was quieter after reading it. I don't know who it was from. I haven't gone through her papers yet. I expect I'll have to." "Do take care of yourself first," Miss Marple said. "The papers will keep." She said her goodbyes with the warmth of someone who had simply come to offer comfort, and walked back through the cottage's side gate to the lane. The clock had bothered George too, she could see. It had settled into him the way something true settles, not noisily, but with weight. Someone in Ashenford knew how to wind a French carriage clock, and had done so. The question was whether that someone had done it to mark time, or to hide it. The apple tree at the far end of the garden was just beginning to bud, small knots of potential at the ends of the grey branches, not yet opened, not yet committed to being anything other than possibility. In a week they would be white blossom. In 2 months, the first hard little fruits. Eleanor Peel had been planning to plant this season's vegetables. She had turned the soil. She had been making arrangements for the future. And someone, somewhere in the village, had decided that her future was something that needed ending before it could unfold. Chapter 4. Vera Lansing arrives. Vera Lansing was not what you expected, which was, Miss Marple suspected, precisely the point. She was 68, and she wore 68 with the calm, combative confidence of a woman who had decided some years ago that age was a fact, but not a philosophy. Her hair was white and cut in a sharp, deliberate style. Her coat was cashmere and grey. She carried herself with the particular assurance of a person who has spent a long time in the city and knows that this projects an impression in villagers, and does not especially object to that impression. She was sitting in the lounge at the Wheatsheaf, Ashenford's single public house, which managed to be warm without being shabby and quiet without being dull, with a glass of dry white wine and a small leather notebook when Miss Marple came in at noon. Mrs. Croft had told Miss Marple that Vera Lansing always stayed at the Wheatsheaf when she came to visit. She doesn't stay with George, Mrs. Croft had said, with the tone of a woman noting this for the record. She and Celia don't see eye to eye. And she always said Hollow Birch Cottage made her feel like being buried. Miss Marple sat down at a nearby table with her pot of tea and her general air of being a harmless old woman looking for somewhere comfortable to wait out the midday hours. Vera glanced up, recognised her from the church hall, and gave a brief, considering nod. Miss Marple, Mrs. Lansing, I am so dreadfully sorry about your sister. Vera received this with the straight-backed composure of a person who has already absorbed the blow and is now moving through the aftermath with deliberate efficiency. Thank you. Eleanor was not an easy person to be close to, but she was my sister, and I shall miss her considerably. It was an honest answer. Miss Marple appreciated honest answers, particularly when they were dressed in something other than convention. Were you with her long yesterday evening? About 2 hours. I arrived just before 6 and left at 8. She was alive when I left, I want to be absolutely clear about that. Alive and in her armchair and drinking her evening sherry in the way she always did. Vera's voice was steady. Too steady, perhaps, but steadiness in the recently bereaved can mean many things, and Miss Marple did not rush to conclusions. Was she in good spirits? She was. Vera paused, and in the pause there was something genuine. She was worried about something. I could tell. Eleanor worried quietly, she never made a drama of it, but when something was on her mind you could see it in the way she held herself, a certain tightness. She had it last night. Did she tell you what it was? No, and I didn't press her. Eleanor did not like being pressed. If she wanted to tell you something, she would tell you in her own time and in her own way. Vera picked up her wineglass and set it down again without drinking from it. I had gone over because she'd telephoned me on Friday. Said she wanted to talk about something. Something she needed to think through with someone she trusted. I came down on Sunday because I had commitments I couldn't rearrange. I should have come sooner. The word trusted hung in the room for a moment. Miss Marple noted it. There's something she wanted to discuss, Miss Marple said. Did she give any indication? Not over the telephone. In person, last night she started to say something. About a letter she'd received. She said there were things coming to light. That phrase, things coming to light, and then she seemed to decide she wasn't ready to say more yet. She said she needed to be sure first. Sure of what? She didn't say. Vera looked at her directly. I know how this sounds. But Eleanor was not a woman who invented things or imagined threats. If she said things were coming to light, there were things coming to light. Miss Marple turned her teacup in its saucer. The carriage clock, she said. The French clock on the parlour mantelpiece. When you were there last night, was it running? Vera blinked. No, it was stopped, as always. I remember thinking, habit really, that it was exactly 4:20, which was what it always showed. And when you found Eleanor this morning? I didn't go into the parlour, Vera said, her voice altering slightly. I could see from the doorway. I could see enough. I telephoned Pat, and then I went outside. She set her wineglass down with a small, precise click. Why are you asking about the clock? Because it was ticking this morning, Miss Marple said, and your sister told me, at the Wednesday tea, that it had not worked in 30 years. Vera was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was lower, and the steadiness in it was not composed over blankness, but over something very particular. Edmund's clock, she said. He stopped it when he died. No. He stopped it before he died, before he knew. Forgive me, I've muddled it. She took a breath. Edmund stopped that clock in 1994, about 6 months before he died. Eleanor never said why. I always assumed it was sentiment. 6 months before he died, Miss Marple thought. Not after. She thanked Vera and left her to her wine and her small leather notebook and her thoughts, which were clearly more numerous and less orderly than her appearance suggested. In the lane outside, the afternoon had turned grey, and the cherry tree by the churchyard gate was dropping pale petals in the absence of any wind, as if the tree had simply decided it was done with blossom and was moving on. Edmund had stopped the clock 6 months before he died. Not after. Before, Miss Marple walked up the hill to Hollow Birch Cottage and stood outside the gate for a moment, thinking about the things a stopped clock keeps, and the things a running one gives away. Chapter 5. The Postmistress Remembers. The post office in Ashenford occupied the front room of a narrow stone building on the lower High Street, wedged between the greengrocer and a small shop that sold wool and cards and cheerful miscellany. The narrow building always smelled, on entry, of cardboard and ink and that particular dry warmth that accumulates in small rooms where papers are sorted every morning before the village is properly awake. A rubber band jar sat on the counter beside a roll of brown tape, and above the counter hung a hand-lettered notice about registered post hours that had been there so long it had been ignored by everyone, including the person who wrote it. It was run by a woman named Doris Emmett, who had been postmistress for 26 years, and who knew, with serene and comprehensive accuracy, the postal habits of every household in the village. Doris was not a small woman, and she occupied her post office with the comfortable authority of someone who has grown to fill their space in precisely the right way. She had reading glasses on a chain around her neck, which she deployed with the decisive efficiency of a professional tool. She knew which households received regular parcels from which senders, whose magazines arrived on which days, and who had recently changed their address or begun receiving correspondence from unfamiliar sources. She had not, in 26 years, told any of this to anyone who hadn't had a legitimate reason to know. Miss Marple arrived at 2:15, just as the afternoon post had been sorted, and before the 2:30 queue formed. She bought stamps, inquired after the village newsletter, which Doris co-edited with a woman from the lower village named Mrs. Hatch, and then lingered in the comfortable way of an elderly woman who has nowhere urgent to be. Terrible news about Eleanor Peel, Miss Marple said, addressing the stamps she was examining. Dreadful. Doris clipped this word off cleanly, with genuine feeling behind it. I saw her on Thursday. She came in to collect a recorded delivery. Looking well, I thought. That's the thing, isn't it? You never expect it. A recorded delivery, Miss Marple said. How unusual for her. She'd had 1 or 2 recently. Doris paused with the self-restraint of a woman who has a strong policy and is consulting it. I don't generally say who receives what. Of course not. Very proper. Miss Marple looked up from the stamps. I only ask because she seemed distracted this past week. Her home help mentioned she'd had a letter that unsettled her. One assumes the two may be connected. Doris appeared to weigh something. Then, I'll say this much. The last recorded delivery she collected was from a firm of solicitors in Dorchester. The return address was on the envelope. I couldn't help seeing it. That was about 10 days ago. Solicitors, Miss Marple said. I see. And before that, about a month ago, there was one from the same firm. She came in for that one herself too. She never sent things to be collected. She was always in for the post by 9:30. Never missed. But these she waited on, like she was expecting them. Miss Marple folded her stamps carefully into her bag. Was there anything else delivered recently? Something that might have come by ordinary post, not recorded? Doris considered. There was a hand-delivered letter about a week ago Thursday. Not posted, it was slipped through the box at the cottage. I know because Mrs. Aubrey on the corner said she saw someone going up the path in the early evening and posting something. She mentioned it to me because they didn't use the village post box, which struck her as deliberate. Did Mrs. Aubrey see who it was? She thought she recognised the coat. Doris paused again, more thoroughly this time. She said it looked like the coat Mrs. Celia Peel usually wears, the dark green one with the collar, though it was getting dim, she said, so she couldn't be certain. Miss Marple absorbed this in the peaceful way she absorbed most things, without visible reaction, without haste. "Thank you, Doris," she said. "This newsletter is really very well produced. I must congratulate you and Mrs. Hatch." She left the post office and stood on the pavement for a moment in the fine cold drizzle that had begun while she was inside. Celia Peel, George Peel's wife, who had, by George's account, been at home all Sunday evening, who did not get along with Vera Lansing, who was going to come and help sort through Eleanor Peel's house and papers. 2 recorded deliveries from a Dorchester solicitor's firm. In the past month, a hand-delivered letter a week ago Thursday, possibly from Celia, and then Eleanor on Friday, distracted and quiet after reading something, making plans with her sister to talk things through. And 30 years' worth of silence in a small gilt clock ended on the night Eleanor died. The drizzle increased slightly. Miss Marple put up her small umbrella and walked up the hill, thinking about the Dorchester solicitors, and about the particular kind of letter that arrives recorded delivery and makes a person quiet afterwards, and about what it means when a family begins to move things before the arrangements have been made. Chapter 6. The Solicitor's Letter. Dr. Rennie was a careful man, who chose his words the way a careful man chooses his footing on uncertain ground, with deliberate attention and without rushing. He had been the Ashenford village doctor for 18 years and knew most of his patients rather well. His consulting room smelled of antiseptic and old paperbacks. He kept a row of them on the shelf above the blood pressure cuff, a detail that Miss Marple had always found quietly reassuring, as if a doctor who read novels might understand that people were more complicated than their symptoms. He also had the useful quality of being willing to say when he was not entirely certain of something, which was rarer in his profession than it should have been. Miss Marple found him at the surgery at 3:30, between his afternoon appointments. She had telephoned ahead, citing a matter of some delicacy, and he had made time without hesitation. He was that sort of man. "The heart," he said, when Miss Marple had settled into the chair across from his desk. "Yes. The post-mortem will confirm, of course. I can't be definitive until then. But the preliminary examination is consistent with cardiac arrest. She had a history, mild, but there. We'd been monitoring. Had she complained of any symptoms recently? At her last appointment 3 weeks ago, she was very well, better than expected, in fact. She mentioned some mild fatigue, but that can be so many things at her age. Miss Marple thought about Eleanor Peel in her best blouse, sitting upright in her armchair in the dead of night, her left hand slightly displaced. Could cardiac arrest come on so suddenly that a person simply sat down, without any warning at all? It can happen that way, yes, especially if a person is already seated and comfortable. He paused. "You have doubts." "I have questions," Miss Marple said. "Which are perhaps the same thing, at my stage of life." She folded her hands. She was dressed in her day clothes, not her night clothes. She was in the parlour, not the bedroom. Does that suggest anything to you? That she had not yet gone to bed when it happened? Or that she rose in the night and went downstairs? Neither is inconsistent with cardiac arrest. "The carriage clock on the mantelpiece," Miss Marple said. "You noticed it?" Dr. Rennie looked at her steadily. I noticed it was ticking, yes. I understand from George that it was not in working order before. It was not working on Friday evening. The home help confirmed that. And yet it was ticking on Monday morning. A silence. The doctor's consulting room was very quiet, just the low sound of the heating system and the occasional creak of the old building settling into its afternoon. "I'll be thorough," he said. "I want you to know that. I'll request a full toxicological screen as part of the post-mortem." "I think that would be very wise," Miss Marple said. He walked her to the door of the surgery, and on the step he said, quietly, "She was not a woman who frightened easily, Eleanor Peel. She came in 3 weeks ago, looking, not frightened. Watchful, as if she'd heard something in the night, and was listening to see if it came again." "Did she say anything?" "Just that she wanted to make sure her affairs were in order. That's not unusual at her age. But the manner of it, she asked me to confirm that her recent egg results were on file and readily accessible." He paused. "That's not a request you make when you expect to have all the time in the world." Miss Marple thanked him and walked down the surgery path. The afternoon was very grey now, the kind of grey that is not quite rain and not quite not, that settles over English Aprils like a held breath. Affairs in order. Letter from solicitors. Plans to speak with her sister. A clock set ticking, as if time were being deliberately marked or deliberately falsified. She stopped at the bench near the churchyard wall, which was sheltered enough, and sat for a moment. An older gentleman she didn't know walked past with a spaniel on a lead and gave her a polite nod, and she nodded back. Normal village life proceeding around her. She thought about Edmund Peel, and when he had stopped that clock. 6 months before he died, Vera had said, not after, but before. Not from grief, but from some other reason, or some other moment. What had happened 6 months before Edmund Peel died? What had passed between a husband and wife in a small parlour in Ashenford that caused a clock to be silenced for 30 years and never spoken of again? And who had found the clock, wound it, set it running, and left it ticking on a mantelpiece beside the body of the woman who had kept it still? The spaniel sniffed at the base of the bench and was gently retrieved. The grey afternoon continued. Miss Marple thought, I shall need to know about Edmund. Not who he was in the obvious way, but who he was in the particular way that a stopped clock knows. Chapter 7. What Celia Did Not Say. Celia Peel was the sort of woman who presented herself well and knew it. Not in any dishonest or calculating sense. It was simply that she had grown up in a household where the difference between what you felt and what you showed was considered a kind of good manners, and she had carried that discipline into her adult life with the unconscious ease of a practised habit. She was 42, trim, with the cautious warmth of someone who gives friendliness in measured portions. Miss Marple had met her once before briefly in the village shop. She had formed an impression of competence and watchfulness. Not unkind, not cold, but definitely watching. Celia opened the door of the Peel house in Church Street at 4 o'clock, still wearing her coat, as if she had recently come in. She looked tired. There were the specific hollows under her eyes that come from a night of interrupted sleep. Miss Marple. George mentioned you might come. She stepped back. Please come in. The Peel house in Church Street was comfortable and tidy, with children's drawings pinned to the hallboard and a smell of that morning's coffee still in the air. It was the house of a family that functioned. Everything in it had a place, and was in it. I won't stay long, Miss Marple said. I only wanted to offer my condolences. And too well. I find I am an old woman who cannot leave a loose end alone. The clock, Celia said, before Miss Marple could continue. She said it with a certain flatness that contained, if Miss Marple was not mistaken, a degree of relief. The relief of someone who has been waiting for a thing to be said and is glad to stop waiting. Yes, the clock. Celia sat down in the kitchen. Miss Marple sat across from her. Between them on the table was a mug of cold tea that Celia had clearly made and not drunk. I went to see Eleanor last week, Celia said. On Thursday evening. I went because of the letters she'd been receiving. From the solicitors. Miss Marple waited. Eleanor had engaged a firm of solicitors in Dorchester about 2 months ago. Without telling George, she was changing her will. Celia said this with the measured delivery of someone who has rehearsed how to state a fact without adding colouring to it. George found out last week, not through Eleanor, but through a coincidence. He knows someone at the Dorchester Chamber of Commerce who mentioned the firm's name in passing. And George realised his mother had mentioned that same firm in an old letter years ago. And something clicked. He asked Eleanor directly. She said yes, she was updating her arrangements, and that it was her right and she'd tell him everything in good time. How did he take that? Badly, Celia said simply. Not angrily. He wasn't angry with her. He was worried. He thought she was being influenced by someone. Vera, he assumed. They have a complicated history. She picked up the cold mug and set it down. I went to see Eleanor to try to understand what she was doing. Not to interfere. I wanted to understand. And did she tell you? Some of it. She said she had become aware of something in the past few months. Something about Edmund. Her voice changed slightly on Edmund's name. Not much, but enough. She was being very careful in how she phrased it. She said she had found a document among Edmund's old papers that she needed to have properly examined. That it might affect certain arrangements. She said she wasn't ready to speak about it yet, but that everything would become clear. A document among Edmund's papers, Miss Marple said, after 12 years. She'd been going through his study. She'd been putting it off since he died, people do, with the rooms of the dead. She started, this January. And she found something. Miss Marple thought of a clock stopped 6 months before its owner died, and a wife who kept it stopped for 30 years, and a woman who began going through old papers in January and found something that made her change her will. The letter you delivered to Hollow Birch Cottage, Miss Marple said gently, last Thursday evening. Celia looked at her. It was a long, measured look, not defensive exactly, but assessing. I wrote to her after our conversation, she said. I wanted her to know that whatever she'd found, whatever she decided, it wouldn't change how George felt about her. That he loved her. That I supported that. I didn't want her going forward into whatever she'd found, feeling like her family was against her. That was kind, Miss Marple said, and she meant it. The clock. Celia's hands wrapped around the mug. I noticed it had stopped, that it was always stopped. Eleanor mentioned it once, years ago. Said Edmund had stopped it when something happened. She didn't say what. You didn't wind it. No, I wouldn't have known how. She paused. But I think I know who did. The kitchen was very still. Miss Marple did not lean forward. Who? She asked. Celia looked down at the cold tea in her mug. That's the thing I'm not yet sure I should say, she said carefully. Because if I'm wrong, it's a very serious thing to say. And if I'm right, she stopped. If I'm right, it changes everything. Chapter 8. Edmund's Papers. The study at Hollow Birch Cottage had not been touched since Eleanor's death. The constable who came on Monday morning had sealed nothing. It was not that sort of scene, at least not yet. But some unspoken agreement seemed to have kept the family away from it. The front parlour where Eleanor was found had been tidied. The kitchen had been cleaned, but the study was exactly as Eleanor had left it, which meant it was exactly as she had arranged it in the weeks before she died. George had asked Miss Marple, on Tuesday morning, if she would come and look at it with him. He said this in the way that people say things they've been thinking about for some time, not quite a request, not quite a confession, but something partway between. I think you'll see what I mean, was all he added. Which was the kind of thing that tells you a person has moved past wondering whether there's something to see, and into the quieter, harder country of knowing there is. The study was at the back of the cottage, a small room with bookshelves on 3 walls, and a desk facing the window that looked into the back garden. The birch trees were visible from here, pale and still. The desk was covered in papers, sorted into loose piles, with the careful untidiness of someone who knows where everything is, even if it doesn't look like it. There were clearly 3 distinct phases of sorting visible. One pile, older, slightly yellowed, fastened with a rubber band, appeared to be household documents of the ordinary kind. A second pile was more recent and contained correspondence, the top letter from a Dorchester address. A third pile, placed slightly apart from the others and weighted down with a brass letter opener, consisted of perhaps 20 pages of various sizes. "Those," George said, gesturing at the third pile, "those are what she found." Miss Marple moved to the desk and looked at the pile without touching it. The topmost page was handwritten, in a hand she didn't recognise, compact, careful, the letters evenly spaced. Below it she could see the edge of what appeared to be a typed document, official in format. "She found them in January," George said from the doorway. "In the locked drawer, there's a small locked drawer in the bottom left. I never knew there was a key. She must have had the key all along." He paused. "Or found it. Do you know what the documents are?" "She told me, some of them. Not all." He was very still. "There is apparently a letter from Edmund addressed to Mother dated about 6 months before he died, and there's a document that relates to something that happened before they married, something he hadn't told her, or had told her, but not completely." Miss Marple looked at the letter opener on the pile. It was a good solid piece, brass with a small inlaid design on the handle. Heavy enough to serve as a paperweight. "Something that might affect the will?" she asked. "Apparently there's a question about whether Edmund was married before. Before my mother." George's voice was precise and careful, which was the voice of someone holding a difficult thing without letting it take hold of him. "A brief marriage. In 1962. In Scotland. That ended," he said it ended. "But whether it ended legally, completely, correctly, that seems to be what the solicitors were examining." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. A previous marriage. If it had not ended legally, Edmund's marriage to Eleanor would have been invalid. Eleanor would not have been his legal wife. George himself. "You understand the implications," George said. It was not a question. "I do," Miss Marple said. "Yes." She looked at the third pile again. "Has anyone else seen these documents? Besides you and your mother?" "Vera knows something," Mother spoke to her on Sunday. Started to. "And Celia knows there was a document of some kind. She doesn't know the details. And before your mother found them in January, no one else had access to this drawer? I didn't even know it existed." He was looking at the birch trees through the window. "Though that doesn't mean much, I suppose. Mother was very private about this room." Miss Marple thought about a clock stopped 6 months before Edmund Peel's death. The same 6 months as the letter in that pile was dated. Edmund had written to Eleanor, sealed something important in a locked drawer, and stopped the clock. A man who knew he was going to die? Or a man who knew he'd done something that needed containing? The distinction seemed significant. She thought about what kind of person winds a stopped clock in the house of a woman who has just died, and why and when, and whether it was done before or after. "Your wife was here on Thursday evening," Miss Marple said. "She told me she wrote Eleanor a letter of support. She did not go into the study." "I know," George said. "She told me. Who else had access to this house? In the weeks before your mother died?" George's jaw tightened slightly. "Vera has a key. She's always had one. From years ago. Mother never took it back. The birch trees were very still in the garden." Miss Marple looked at them for a long moment and thought the locked drawer was found open. Someone had looked at what was inside, and then, either in satisfaction or in alarm, someone had gone to the parlour and wound a clock that had been still for 30 years. Chapter 9. What Vera kept. Miss Marple asked to see Vera Lancing again on Tuesday afternoon, and Vera came to the sitting room at Mrs. Croft's house at 4 o'clock, which was something of a testament to the way Miss Marple asked things, with such warm and unanxious courtesy that the request felt less like an inconvenience and more like an invitation. She came in still wearing the cashmere coat, as if she had not quite committed to arriving, but she sat down when she was asked, and she accepted a cup of tea, and she held the cup in the composed way of a person who has decided to maintain their surface regardless of what is happening underneath it. "I know you've been speaking to George," Vera said, "and to Celia." "I've been trying to understand your sister," Miss Marple said. "She seemed, to the brief time I knew her, like someone worth understanding properly." This appeared to work in some small way. Vera's shoulders settled fractionally. "She was," she said. She was more complex than people gave her credit for. People saw the composure and thought there was nothing underneath it. There was a great deal underneath it. "Tell me about Edmund." Vera was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who doesn't want to speak, but the quiet of someone choosing where to start. "Edmund was a good man. I don't want anything I say to suggest otherwise. He loved Eleanor in the way that some men love, imperfectly, quietly, durably. But he had history, the first marriage." Vera looked at her. "Eleanor told you?" "George told me, and I imagine you've known for some time." A pause. "I've known since 1994, Vera said. "Edmund told me. Not Eleanor. Me. 6 months before he died. He came to see me in London. He said he'd done something before they married that he needed to confess to someone, and he couldn't tell Eleanor because it would hurt her too deeply, and he was dying and he needed someone to know." She set down her cup with the same small, precise click as before. The marriage in Scotland was real. He had been married at 22 to a woman named Catherine Hale. They separated after 18 months. He was told that she had divorced him, but when he tried to verify it before marrying Eleanor, the records were confused, incomplete. He didn't pursue it as hard as he should have. He told himself it was likely fine, that she would have divorced him eventually, that the records were simply poorly kept. And was it fine? No. Catherine Hale died in 1993 without ever having divorced him. He found out 6 months before he died, through a solicitor he'd finally engaged to look into it properly. Which meant his marriage to Eleanor was, technically, invalid. Which meant Eleanor was not his legal wife. Which meant George had complications. Miss Marple set down her own cup very quietly. "He told you all of this. In 1994. And not Eleanor. He said she would find it better not to know, that she had built her life on the marriage and the knowledge would destroy it for her. That the complications for George were theoretical and not necessarily fatal, that an intestacy lawyer could navigate them." Vera's voice was very controlled. "He asked me to keep it. And you did. I kept it for 30 years. She said it without self-pity and without pride, simply as a fact that had its own weight. He stopped the clock, he said, because he couldn't bear to look at something that measured the time he'd stolen from her. A marriage that was 30 years of time he'd borrowed under a false name. That's what he said. Those words. Miss Marple thought about 30 years of a stopped clock, polished every fortnight by the woman it had most deceived. "Did you ever consider telling her?" "Every year," Vera said. "Every year when I came down. I sat in that parlour and looked at that stopped clock and thought about whether to tell her." She paused. "And then in January she telephoned me and said she'd found Edmund's letter. The letter he'd written to her in 1994 that he'd sealed and locked in the drawer and apparently intended her to find after he died, but somehow she never had, until now. The letter explained everything. The letter explained everything. 30 years late." Miss Marple sat very still. Eleanor Peel had read a letter from her dead husband and learned that her marriage had been false, that her name was not legally hers, that the man she had kept a stopped clock for had borrowed her life from her and not said so. "And the clock," Miss Marple said. "She wound it," Vera said quietly. "She told me. She found the letter in January and she read it and she sat with it for a week and then she wound the clock. Because she said, the time belongs to me, not to him. Every hour of it. Every stopped hour. There was a long silence. Then it was already running, Miss Marple said, when you were there on Sunday evening. Yes, Vera said. It had been running since January. I sat there Sunday evening and heard it ticking, and I thought, she's set herself free. A pause. She was alive when I left her. I need you to know that. I do know that, Miss Marple said. And then Vera. Is there anyone who might have wanted those documents not to come to light? Anyone who would have been harmed by what Eleanor found? Chapter 10. The Man from Dorchester. The solicitor's firm was called Mosswood and Hale, and they occupied the upper floor of a converted townhouse in Dorchester, reached by a staircase of dark polished wood that smelled comfortingly of beeswax and old dust. Miss Marple did not go to Dorchester herself. She was, as she reminded herself, technically on arrest, but she telephoned, and the particular quality of her voice on the telephone, which combined warmth with unmistakable precision, produced a junior partner named Mr. Timothy Voss, who agreed to come to Ashenford on Wednesday morning. He arrived exactly on time, which Miss Marple appreciated. He wore a grey suit and carried a briefcase of good leather, worn at the corners in the way that suggests long use rather than neglect. He was younger than she expected, barely 40, with the earnest, methodical manner of a man who believes deeply in doing things correctly and slightly nervously about doing them incorrectly. He sat in Mrs. Croft's sitting room with his briefcase on his knees and a cup of tea he had accepted and not touched. The morning light came through the window at a sympathetic angle, and outside a blackbird was making an unreasonably cheerful noise in the cherry tree, apparently indifferent to the seriousness of the occasion. Mrs. Peel came to us in February, he said. Through a referral from a colleague, she had found documents relating to her late husband's estate and was seeking advice on several matters. First, the question of whether her marriage was legally valid. Second, the implications for her son's inheritance of the Peel family property. Third, what, if any, obligation she had to disclose this information, and to whom. And your conclusions? Miss Marple asked. On the first question, the marriage was not valid. Catherine Hale never divorced Edmund Peel. We confirmed this through the Scottish records, which are now digitised and searchable in ways they were not in the 1990s. Catherine Hale died in 1993, unmarried from a legal standpoint, though she had been living with a partner. Her death triggered no divorce proceedings because no divorce had ever been filed, so Eleanor was, legally, never Mrs. Peel, correct. Though she would not necessarily have known this, and the moral circumstances are complicated. Edmund Peel did not knowingly deceive her at the point of marriage, or not entirely. He had reason to believe the situation was resolved. The second question? George's inheritance? Mr. Voss placed his briefcase flat on his knees and opened it. He removed a slim folder. This is more complex. George was born within the marriage, which was not legally a marriage. However, the property that came to Eleanor from Edmund was left to her absolutely, in a valid will, and she has the right to bequeath it as she chooses. The complication arises from the Peel family property, a farmhouse and 2 acres in Dorset, which was entailed in a manner that specified inheritance by a legitimate heir. The farmhouse would not pass to George. Under a strict reading of the entailment, no. It would pass to Edmund's nearest legitimate heir, which is a first cousin in Canada who was not previously aware of his interest. Miss Marple considered this. A farmhouse and 2 acres, she said. Is it valuable? Considerably. The property market in that part of Dorset has, he paused. Yes, it is quite valuable. And did Eleanor plan to challenge the entailment, or accept it? She was considering her options. But she was very clear about one thing. She intended to be fully transparent with George and with the family about everything she'd found. She was not prepared to let it stay hidden. She'd lived with a hidden thing for 30 years without knowing it, and she didn't, her words, intend to carry on the tradition. Miss Marple thought, so anyone who needed the matter to stay hidden had very little time. Did anyone else know she had consulted you? She asked. We sent correspondence to her recorded delivery. The envelopes were plain, but the return address... He looked faintly uncomfortable. The return address was printed on the envelope, as is standard practice. So anyone who saw her collect the post, or who collected the post on her behalf, or who saw the envelope, would have been able to identify the firm. Yes, he closed the folder. I'm aware that she died on Sunday night. I was distressed to hear it. She struck me as a woman of considerable clarity and courage. She knew what she'd found was going to cause disruption. She wasn't afraid of it. No, Miss Marple agreed. I don't think she was. After Mr. Voss had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while in Mrs. Croft's sitting room, with the morning sun coming through the window in a long, warm bar and falling across the carpet in that particular way it does in the late spring, when the angle of it has shifted enough to reach further into. Rooms than winter allows. A farmhouse and 2 acres in Dorset. Valuable property. A legal entailment, a legitimate heir in Canada who didn't know his interest. And Eleanor Peel, who had found all of this and intended to speak. She thought about who had the most to lose from Eleanor speaking. And she thought about a clock that had been running since January, and that everyone who visited Hollow Birch Cottage would have heard ticking. Everyone who visited would have known the clock was running, which meant anyone who visited had reason to wonder why. And one of those people, she thought, had not merely wondered. One of them had gone looking for the answer. Chapter 11. The Vicar's Wife Remembers. Mrs. Harriet Blount, the vicar's wife at St. Cuthbert's, was one of those women whose social memory functions like a very well-organised card index. She remembered who had sat where at every church event for the past 15 years, who had come late and who had left early, and who had spoken to whom in the vestry afterwards, and she retained this information not out of any particular nosiness, but out of the innate professional skill of someone whose occupation requires her to manage the complex social ecology of a village congregation without letting it become apparent that she is doing so. She was a slight woman with sharp blue eyes and a cardigan that appeared to have been knitted by someone who loved her very much and had started with good intentions. The vicarage sitting room where she received Miss Marple smelled of furniture polish and fresh flowers, and something faintly biscuity that turned out to be lemon cake, which she served on small plates with a firmness that suggested declining was not really on offer. The cake was, Miss Marple noted, extremely good, the kind with a sharp lemon icing that makes the roof of the mouth feel briefly alive, and a crumb that holds together without being dense. Someone had paid close attention to that cake. Eleanor was at the Thursday afternoon Bible study group, she told Miss Marple, who had come under the pretext of inquiring about the flower rota, 3 weeks ago. She wasn't a regular attender, she came perhaps once a month, but she came 3 weeks ago, and she was very quiet throughout. Usually she contributed a little. Not that Thursday. Was anyone with her? Did she speak to anyone after? She spoke to James Fallow, Mrs. Blount said. Which was unusual because Eleanor and James have always been rather cool towards each other, since the business with the planning application, years ago. But after the group finished, she went and spoke to him quite deliberately. I noticed because of the deliberateness of it. She walked across the room to him. Miss Marple kept her expression pleasantly curious. James Fallow, the estate agent? Yes, he's been on the parish council for years. He and Edmund were quite close at one point. They'd done some business together, I think, property-related. But Eleanor and James, she paused, choosing a word. Frosty. Since about 2012, when there was some unpleasantness about a field near the allotments. Do you know what they discussed on Thursday? I heard very little of it. But I did hear James Fallow say, quite distinctly, "That was a long time ago, Eleanor." And Eleanor said something I didn't catch. And then she left without her usual goodbye to anyone, which was unlike her. Miss Marple filed James Fallow away carefully. Did anyone else visit Eleanor regularly? From the village? Mrs. Blount thought. The home help, obviously. George on Sundays, Vera when she came down, and James Fallow used to call occasionally, less so in recent years. I believe they had some ongoing arrangement about the field, something never quite settled. Miss Marple walked from the vicarage back through the churchyard in the mild afternoon sun turning things over, James Fallow. An estate agent, who had known Edmund, who had done business with Edmund, who had maintained a cool distance from Eleanor for years and been approached by her 3 weeks ago and said, "That was a long time ago." The Peel farmhouse in Dorset. An estate agent would understand very clearly what a farmhouse and 2 acres in that market were worth. An estate agent who had known Edmund, who might have known about Edmund's history, or some part of it, would understand the implications of Eleanor's discovery. And if Edmund's legitimate heir suddenly appeared and the property changed hands, any long-standing professional arrangement around that property. She stopped at the churchyard gate. A long-standing arrangement, some ongoing matter about a field, Mrs. Blount had said. Never quite settled. If James Fallow had been managing the Dorset property, informally, perhaps profitably, and if Eleanor's discovery threatened to bring in lawyers and a legitimate heir and full legal scrutiny, Miss Marple thought, I should like to speak to Mr. James Fallow, but carefully. Very carefully. She walked on through the village. The afternoon had turned warm and still, the kind of April afternoon that smells of turned earth and fresh grass, and the particular dusty sweetness of old stone warmed by the sun. 2 children on bicycles sailed past her with an operatic freedom. A cat sat on a wall and watched her with the serene indifference of something that has decided everything is equally beneath its interest. The village of Ashenford was very beautiful in this light, and very deceptive, Miss Marple thought, in the way that beautiful things can be, presenting a surface of peace while something else quietly worked underneath it, like water beneath ice. She passed the post office and saw through the window that Doris Emmett was speaking to someone at the counter. The someone was a broad-shouldered man in a good overcoat with his back to the window, and as Miss Marple passed he turned just enough for her to see his profile. She walked on. James Fallow. In the post office. Looking from the angle of his shoulders as if he were asking about something rather urgently. She did not slow her pace. She kept walking, calmly, up the hill. Tomorrow, she thought, she would speak to James Fallow tomorrow, and she would know a great deal more about what to ask. Chapter 12. The Estate Agent's Confession. James Fallow had the face of a man who has spent many years presenting himself as straightforwardly decent, and the eyes of a man for whom this has been slightly more effort than it looks. He was 61, well dressed without being showy, and he met Miss Marple at his office above the High Street, with the careful cordiality of someone who has been expecting a difficult conversation and has decided to get through it by being very pleasant. His office was just right, not too lavish, not too sparse. The certificates on the wall were genuine. The family photograph on the desk was turned at an angle that made it visible without seeming to display it. He was, Miss Marple thought, a man who knew exactly what impression each element of his environment created and had arranged them accordingly. You knew Edmund Peel, Miss Marple said, when the preliminary courtesies had been dispensed with. Very well. For many years. His voice was measured. Edmund was a good friend and a sound businessman. We worked together on several property matters over the years. The Peel farmhouse in Dorset, a pause, small enough to be deniable, but there. Edmund owned a property in Dorset, yes. I handled some of the administrative aspects for Eleanor after his death. She didn't want to deal with the practical management of it. It was tenanted, a farming family, perfectly good arrangement, and she asked me to manage the correspondence and the lease renewals. For 12 years. It's not unusual to have a long-standing informal arrangement in a village. He met her eyes with the pleasant frankness of a man who has decided that the best defence is complete reasonableness. Eleanor trusted me. Edmund had trusted me. And the tenants, did they pay a rent to Eleanor directly, or through your office, through my office, as her agent? Standard practice. At market rate, the pause this time was slightly less small. Rents in Dorset have increased considerably over 12 years. I reviewed the arrangement periodically. When Eleanor found the documents about Edmund's first marriage, Miss Marple said, moving without hurry, and engaged Mosswood and Hale, she would have discovered that the farmhouse was not hers to manage at all, legally speaking. James Fallow set down his pen very carefully. It was a specific kind of carelessness, the kind where a man is being careful to appear unconcerned. That's a legal complexity I'm not qualified to judge. No. But you would have known, if the entailment were enforced, that your 12-year arrangement would come under scrutiny. The rents, the management fees, the lease renewals. Miss Marple kept her voice entirely pleasant. Eleanor spoke to you at the Thursday Bible study group 3 weeks ago. He looked at her. She came to me, yes. She said she had found something in Edmund's papers that related to the Dorset property and that she would be in touch. She asked me to be prepared to provide documentation of the management arrangements. And how did you feel about that? I felt... He stopped. Something moved behind his carefully maintained expression. I felt that it had been a long time, and that things done a long time ago in the belief that they were being done helpfully don't always bear the same weight of examination that newer things do. Miss Marple thought the rents were not being fully passed on. Some portion of them had stayed in this office, over 12 years tidied away in the normal flow of management fees and administrative costs. Not dramatically dishonest, not the stuff of crime novels, but Eleanor, with a proper solicitor's scrutiny, would have found the discrepancy. And the discrepancy, added to the legal complications about the property's ownership, would have been... You went to Hollow Birch Cottage, Miss Marple said, on Sunday evening. The colour in James Fallow's face changed. Not dramatically, but the careful pleasantness of it cracked just slightly at the edges. I went to speak to her, he said. Vera's car was there. I didn't want to. I waited in my car until Vera left. And then I went to the door. He was looking past her now, at the wall of certificates. She let me in. We sat in the parlour. I tried to explain. About the rents, that it hadn't been dishonest in the way it sounds, that it had been a management fee, that it was within normal parameters, that I hadn't. What time did you leave? Miss Marple asked quietly. About 9:30. His voice was very flat now. She was alive. She was angry, quietly. In the way Eleanor was angry, which was somehow worse than shouting. But she was alive. She said she would speak to her solicitors and that they would be in touch. She was fine. She was absolutely fine. And the clock? He looked at her. What? The carriage clock on the mantelpiece. Was it ticking when you were there? Yes, he said, after a moment. Yes, it was. I remember noticing it, because I remembered it always being stopped. Edmund had stopped it, and Eleanor kept it that way. But it was ticking. Miss Marple rose from her chair. Thank you, Mr. Fallow, she said. I expect you'll be hearing from the police before very long. I would advise you to be as straightforward with them as you have been with me. She left him sitting at his desk looking at his certificates, and she walked down the stairs and out into the afternoon, and she stood on the pavement for a moment, thinking. Eleanor was alive at 9:30. Angry. Absolutely fine. Someone had come after James Fallow. Chapter 13. The Missing Hour. Miss Marple walked slowly back through the village, and she thought about time. She thought about the particular way time behaves in a small village, how it seems to move differently here than in cities, layered and recursive, so that the same lane you walk today was walked by the same families 200 years ago, and the same gossip takes different names but follows the same paths, and a stopped clock in a parlour window is not merely a stopped clock, but a record. A deliberate marker of a moment someone decided should be held still. She thought about the clock stopped at 4:20, which had been its permanent 30-year face until January, when Eleanor had wound it and set it running. The clock that Vera had seen stopped when she arrived at 6 on Sunday, which meant Eleanor had indeed wound it in January, but it had stopped again between January and Sunday, and Eleanor had rewound it, or the clock had been wound by someone else between January and Sunday. And it was running when Vera arrived, and still running when James Fallow sat in the parlour at 9 o'clock, and still running when Eleanor's body was found Monday morning. She stopped in front of the old stone trough by the churchyard wall. It held rainwater and a faint green shimmer of algae, and the reflection in it was the uncertain, slightly distorted reflection of Miss Marple herself and the grey sky above. The clock was running when James Fallow left at 9:30. Eleanor was alive. She was angry and alive. What time had she died? Dr. Rennie had said the post-mortem would give a better estimate, but the preliminary assessment suggested sometime between 9 in the evening and 2 in the morning. The home help had found her at 8:30 Monday morning. She was cold by then. Very cold, Pat had said. Cold enough that she'd been there for many hours. But which hours? Miss Marple thought about Eleanor Peel sitting in her armchair after James Fallow left. Angry, having seen in one evening both her sister and the man who had been quietly overcharging her tenants for 12 years, knowing everything, ready to act. Would she have made a telephone call? Written something down? She thought about the study, the papers sorted into 3 piles, weighted by the brass letter opener. Had the third pile, the documents from Edmund's locked drawer, been moved between Sunday evening and Monday morning? Had anyone been in the study after Eleanor died? She turned and walked up the hill to Hollow Birch Cottage. George had given her a key the day before. She didn't like using it without him present, but there was something in the study she needed to see, and she needed to see it before it was moved or lost or tidied away with the good intention of leaving things neat. The cottage was quiet. It had the particular silence of a house that is missing its person. Not empty in the way of an unused room, but specifically, pointedly absent in the way of a life recently departed. The lavender smell was still in the hall. The kitchen was as Pat had left it. The study was as it had been on Tuesday. Miss Marple went to the desk and looked at the 3 piles. She did not touch them. She looked at the letter opener on the 3rd pile. It was not a letter opener she had seen before. That is to say, she had seen it on Tuesday, placed on the documents, functioning as a paperweight. But she had not, before this moment, registered it with the full attention it deserved. It was brass, with a small inlaid design on the handle. The design was a bird, a particular kind of bird, stylized, with outstretched wings. An heraldic bird. She had seen that bird before, in this village, in this week. She stood very still and thought about where she had seen it. James Fallow's office. Not as a letter opener, as a desk ornament. A small brass figure of a bird with outstretched wings on the corner of his desk, half hidden behind the family photograph. She had clocked it, without registering it, the way you register things that seem to be merely decorative. James Fallow's letter opener was on Eleanor Peel's desk, weighing down the documents from Edmund's locked drawer. Miss Marple thought, he came back, after he said he left. Or he had been in the study, and left this behind, and someone else moved it to the pile. Or Eleanor had taken it from him during their conversation, but why would she do that? Or he had never left at all. Or he had left, and come back. Or someone else had brought it. Or Eleanor had borrowed it on a previous occasion and he had said nothing about it tonight. Each possibility carried a different weight. Miss Marple did not rush to the heaviest one. She took out the small notebook she always carried and made a note of the bird. Then she left the study as she had found it and went back through the cottage to the front door. On the doorstep, she paused. The hour that quietly disappeared was somewhere between 9:30 and whatever time Eleanor Peel's heart had stopped. In that hour, or those hours, something had happened, or someone had come, or something had been done. And a brass letter opener with a heraldic bird had ended up on a pile of documents it had no business being on. Chapter 14. what the clock kept. Constable Harris was young, and he had the intelligence to know it, which is always a promising starting point. He was perhaps 26, with the kind of face that takes notes seriously, a slight lean forward, a pen held as if the information is something that requires physical effort to catch and pin down. He would be a good policeman in 10 years. He was, Miss Marple thought, already not a bad one. When Miss Marple requested a conversation, through the desk sergeant, via a message delivered with the calm authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously, he came to Mrs. Croft's house at 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon with a notebook and an expression of open, careful attention. The afternoon had turned cold, the kind of April cold that forgets. For a day or two, that spring has been agreed upon. Mrs. Croft brought tea without being asked, and then withdrew with the tact of a woman who knows when a room needs fewer people in it. Miss Marple laid it out for him carefully. She began with the clock. She moved to the letter from Edmund, the documents from the locked drawer, the solicitor's visits, the recorded deliveries. She went through Vera's testimony, Celia's account, the postmistress's observations. She laid out James Fallow, the management arrangement, the rents, the Bible study group, the Sunday evening visit. She described the letter opener on the study desk with the heraldic bird. Constable Harris wrote steadily throughout. He did not interrupt. He asked 2 questions, both good ones. The time of death, he said. The post-mortem has placed it between 10 and midnight. That is consistent, Miss Marple said. James Fallow says he left at 9:30. Between 9:30 and midnight, that is the missing hour, or hours. And you believe he came back. I think it is possible he came back. I also think there may be another explanation for the letter opener. It is possible that Eleanor Peel had borrowed it on a previous occasion. She and James Fallow had an ongoing professional relationship after all, whatever its complications. It is possible it had been in the cottage for some time, but the letter opener was placed on the documents from Edmund's locked drawer. If Eleanor had placed it there herself, she would have done so during the period when she was actively working with those documents, which was from January onward. If someone else placed it there after her death, they would have had to have been in the study with knowledge of the 3 piles. Celia has a key, Harris said. George has a key. Vera has a key. James Fallow, I think, does not have a key to the cottage. But he had access to the property management arrangements for the Dorset farmhouse, and it is possible that over 12 years of administration, he and Eleanor had exchanged various items. It is also possible, Miss Marple stopped. Yes, it is also possible that someone let him in. Or that he found the cottage unlocked. Eleanor was still awake at 9:30. She might have left the door unlatched. She paused. Or the door might have been left unlocked by someone who expected him to return. Harris looked up from his notebook. Who would have expected him to return? Someone who knew James Fallow was going to visit. Someone who wanted him to visit, and to be found to have visited. Someone who knew about the management arrangement and the implications of Eleanor's discovery. Someone, Harris said carefully, who benefited from the discovery becoming a criminal matter, or who wanted a suspect ready and waiting. Vera Lansing knew about Edmund's history for 30 years, Miss Marple said. She told Eleanor nothing. If Eleanor had consulted a solicitor and the full complications came to light, Vera's 30 years of silence would look very different. She had known that Eleanor's marriage was invalid. She had known that George's inheritance was complicated. She had said nothing. That's not a crime, Harris said. No, but it is a burden. And a woman who has carried that burden for 30 years and sees it suddenly about to be examined in full daylight, under the scrutiny of solicitors and legal proceedings, that is a woman under very particular pressure. Miss Marple folded her hands. I am not saying she is responsible. I am saying the pressures are various and the people experiencing them are many, and the post-mortem will tell you rather more than I can. The toxicological screen, Harris said. He checked a note. Preliminary results are back. There was a trace quantity of a sedative compound, specifically a benzodiazepine, in low concentration, not a large dose. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. A sedative, enough to cause drowsiness, disorientation. In combination with an underlying cardiac condition, it could be enough to trigger an arrest, or to make a cardiac event more likely and more severe. He paused. It could have been administered in a drink, something she'd consumed that evening. She was drinking her evening sherry, Miss Marple said. When Vera was there, and Vera was the last person confirmed to have left before James Fallow arrived. She looked at her hands. Did she bring the sherry with her, or was it Eleanor's own? Harris wrote something carefully in his notebook. And the glass? Miss Marple asked. We're looking, he said. Miss Marple stood up. The clock, she said, before he could rise. You should know that Eleanor wounded herself, in January when she read Edmund's letter. Vera told me. It has been running since January. The 30 years of stop time was not a mystery, it was a memorial that Eleanor chose to end. Someone wound the clock is not the mystery. The mystery is who could not bear to hear it ticking. She walked with him to the door and said goodbye and closed it behind him. She stood in the hall for a long moment with her hand on the door. A sedative. In the sherry, or in the tea, or in something offered with the naturalness of a visit. Someone who sat with Eleanor Peel on Sunday evening and put something in her drink. Someone Eleanor trusted enough to drink with. Chapter 15. The Last Quiet Thing. The post-mortem results were confirmed on Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon Constable Harris had called in the county Sid, who came quietly and without fuss in the way that they do when a case has been laid out for them with sufficient clarity to allow for a dignified and efficient resolution. The benzodiazepine was identified as a compound commonly found in a medication prescribed for anxiety, of the kind that dissolves readily in liquid and leaves no immediate taste. A search of Vera Lansing's room at the Wheatsheaf found an older prescription for exactly that medication, prescribed 4 years ago and not fully used. The bottle was in her toiletry bag with 17 tablets remaining. The sherry glass from Hollow Birch Cottage's parlour, which James Fallow had noticed and Miss Marple had mentioned, and which the first constable on scene had, with admirable thoroughness, bagged without being certain why, tested positive for trace residue of the compound. Vera was asked to come in for a conversation on Friday afternoon. She came without argument. She sat in the police station interview room with the same straight-backed composure she had maintained throughout, and she told them everything. She had put the tablets in Eleanor's sherry, 3 of them, ground into a fine powder with the back of a spoon in the small cottage kitchen, while Eleanor was in the study showing her the documents. She had done it because Eleanor was going to tell everything, and everything included 30 years of Vera's silence, and 30 years of silence that covers the invalidity of a marriage and the complications of an inheritance is not the same as ordinary silence. It exposes the person who kept it. To scrutiny that Vera Lansing at 68 could not face, she had not intended to kill her. That was also in her statement. She had intended to make Eleanor tired, to cloud the evening slightly, to give herself time to think, to plan, to perhaps persuade Eleanor to slow down, to wait, to consider the damage. She had not given her enough, she said. She had not thought it would matter, with Eleanor's heart. She had not known Eleanor's heart was in the state it was in. She had not known. It is possible that she truly had not known. It is also possible that she had known and had not wished to know, which is a different thing, and which the courts would in time be asked to assess. James Fallow's letter opener was in the study because he had given it to Eleanor as a practical gift 3 years earlier, during the course of the management arrangement, and she had used it in the study and returned it to its place among the study implements. He had recognised it when he sat in the parlour but had said nothing. It was simply an old letter opener, and there are limits to what a man thinks to mention in the middle of a difficult conversation. He had left at 9:30 and had not come back. His account was confirmed by a neighbour who had seen his car leave and had noted the time because she had been putting out her bin and the headlights had caught her as she came back through the gate. He would face other scrutiny in due course, the rents, the management fees, the 12 years of administrative arrangement. But that was a different matter, and a quieter one, and would make its way through the proper channels in the proper time. Miss Marple heard all of this from Constable Harris, who telephoned on Saturday morning with the careful consideration of someone who feels it appropriate to keep a person informed, even if that person is officially simply a visitor on arrest. She thanked him and said he was a very capable young officer, and she meant it entirely. She spent Saturday morning in Mrs. Croft's garden, which was beginning to do the things that gardens do in April when the frosts have finally given up. A sudden, determined emergence of green, of colour, of growth, that seems almost wilfully cheerful given what came immediately before it. The delphiniums, which she had worried about, were showing new growth at their base. Not dead then. Just waiting. George Peel telephoned in the afternoon. He was composed in the way of someone who has cried a great deal and come through to the other side of it. A different composure from before, steadier, with more understanding in it. He said he didn't know how to thank her. She said there was nothing to thank, she had simply noticed things. He said noticing things seemed to be most of the work, and she said yes, she supposed it often was. He asked about the farmhouse in Dorset. She said that would all take time to sort out properly, but that with good legal advice the situation was navigable, and that the cousin in Canada might well be a reasonable person who could be dealt with reasonably. He said he hoped so. She thought he did. She walked up to Hollow Birch Cottage one last time on Sunday afternoon, the day before she was due to go home, back to her own garden and her own delphiniums and the particular life of a woman who pays careful attention to things. The cottage was empty now, properly empty, with the contained stillness of a place where decisions have been made about its future, and the future has not yet arrived. She stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the birch trees in the side garden, which were beginning to leaf, small pale leaves, very new, trembling in the light breeze, with the particular delicacy of something that has recently emerged. She went inside, the key was still in her bag, and stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went into the parlour. The carriage clock was still on the mantelpiece, between the china spaniel and the wedding photograph. It was still ticking. The small, meticulous sound of it filled the quiet room like something breathing. Eleanor Peel had wound it in January, when she read her husband's letter and understood that the time had always belonged to her. She had set it going and let it tick through the last months of her life, and it had been ticking when she died, and it was ticking still. Miss Marple stood in front of it and listened to it for a long moment. 30 years is a very long time for a clock to be still. The things that hold time still, secrets, grief, the particular devotion to a dishonesty that love sometimes becomes, they have weight enough to stop clocks and keep them stopped. And then something happens, and the weight is lifted, and time starts up again. It doesn't mean the lost hours come back. It only means that the hours ahead are honestly counted. She reached out and laid one hand very gently on the side of the clock's case, the cool, smooth brass of it, slightly warm from the mechanism working inside. Then she took her hand away and walked out of Hollow Birch Cottage and pulled the door quietly closed behind her and walked down the hill to Mrs. Croft's house to finish her packing. The clock went on ticking in the empty parlour, each second accounted for, each hour honestly given. That was, Miss Marple thought, on the whole, enough.